All right, folks. Well, welcome back to Table Talk. I'm your host, Yvette Gallinar. Thank you so much for joining me today. And my guest today, I'm super stoked about because he is someone that I have been wanting to interview for quite some time and pick his brain. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to have an awesome talk. But let me tell you a little bit about my guest today. And I am going to read his entire bio. And the reason is because as Josh hasn't been on our show before, and I am certain that this will be one of many, just like many of our guests that have been on for numerous times, and people have always told me, when are you going to have so and so back on? So I know that Josh is going to be one of those. So Josh Peck works in full-time ministry of Prophecy Watchers, and many of you that are our listening audience knows that Prophecy Watchers is one of my all-time favorite shows and programs, and so is Skywatch. We're going to talk a little bit about that because he's been there before as well. But he is a documentary filmmaker, and he wrote and directed and edited the blockbuster film Silent Cry: The Darker Side of Trafficking, along with The Great Delusion, The Second Coming of Earth's Oldest Enemy, and Ragnarok, Humanity's Last Stand, all produced by Skywatch Films, which Dr. Thomas Horn operated before his passing in 2023. I've got to say, Josh, his passing really hit hard to, I know, a very huge audience, including myself. And I shared this with Derek and Sharon Gilbert one of the last times I've had them on, and how I prayed so much for Dr. Tom Horn, and he went to be with the Lord, but he is truly missed. I'm sure that you miss him quite a bit, since you were friends with him and worked together,
Absolutely.
to work together and collaborated so much with him. But Josh is also the author of numerous best-selling books. I'm going to read some of those, including The Lost Prophecies of Qumran, which today we're going to talk a little bit about that, 2025 in the Final Age of Man, Afterlife, and that's co-authored with Donna Howell, which I'm hoping to get on one of these days, and Ali Anderson Henson. The Second Coming of the New Age, co-authored with Stephen Bankars. The Day the Earth Stands Still, co-authored with Derek Gilbert, as many of you know who he is. Unraveling the Multiverse, and Abaddon Ascending, co-authored again with best-selling author Dr. Thomas Horn. Now, Josh is the founder and president of Daily Renegade. We'll give you the website of that later on as well, but it's dailyrenegade.com, where he's hosted a variety of shows and podcasts. He's also been featured on numerous television and radio shows, including the Science Channel's Forbidden History, the History Channel's In Search Of with Zachary Quinto. That's the way I pronounce Quinto, by the way. I don't know if it's Quinto or Quinto, but Quinto's the Spanish way. Um, and Coast to Coast AM with George Noory, Caravan to Midnight with John B. Wells, and the Hangman Report with Doug Hangman. So Josh is married with Christina Peck, with whom he has 5 children. You're a busy man.
Yeah, there's a lot to do.
There is a lot to do. Well, Josh Peck, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Table Talk. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Same here, same here. Well, like I said a moment ago, there are just so many things that I would love to ask you. Off camera, I was telling you that I've been following you for a while, and not to be creepy or anything, but I've been following your work for quite some time. I've got a couple of your books and stuff. So, and of course, Dr. Thomas Horn's books, which I know you've collaborated with, and have watched some of the DVDs that they've put out, and it's just fascinating. Some of the things that you have brought to the surface and have talked about on numerous podcasts, and your work is absolutely, I mean, I hate to keep saying the word amazing because so many people use that word, but it is really bar none. It's fascinating work. And you just released a real fascinating 2-volume book set on prophecies found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. What I want to do is start today, if you don't mind, if uh, here in Table Talk, we've talked a lot about a lot of things. We've talked about UFOs. We've talked about quantum physics, dinosaurs. I mean, just about everything. Dead Sea Scrolls, we haven't really touched on too much. So this is one of the reasons why I loved having you on, or inviting you on. But tell the audience what the Dead Sea Scrolls are. A lot of people don't really know. A lot of Christians don't really understand this, right? And talk to us about this new work that you've compiled.
Sure. Yeah. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are a collection of ancient manuscripts kept by Jewish people. So, and this was at the latest, this was a couple hundred years before the birth of Christ. Many of the manuscripts are probably much older, or copies of even older manuscripts, but they contain all the books of the Old Testament except for Esther. At least we haven't found
Right.
Esther. That doesn't mean that they didn't have it. We just haven't
Yeah.
found it. So, but that's the only exception that we're aware of. They have all the books of the Old Testament, but a lot of extra biblical texts as well. So one of the most familiar ones to people might be the Book of Enoch.
Right.
So that was found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, at least First Enoch.
Okay.
Um, and then there's other books that they held in high regard too, such as Jubilees and things like that. But what's amazing is in these writings, there's a number of prophecies, many of which have already come true. A lot of the prophecies were about the end of their age of Torah, which they believed was coming soon. Which we know that happened during Jesus's ministry around that time, and we're now in what they actually called the age of grace. So
Right.
it's really phenomenal. And just to preface this as well, for people brand new to this who might be a little shaky about extra biblical books, we
Yes.
don't we don't look at these as inspired texts. I look at them, and I open the 2-volume set. I open the books with an introduction about how we got our Bibles and why the Dead Sea Scrolls weren't
Okay.
included. Now, just because something's not inspired, or maybe was inspired for a time but not another time, that doesn't invalidate them completely. I tend to look at it as more history.
Yes.
So if we look at it like that, I think that can help out a lot. We don't use the Dead Sea Scrolls to gain doctrine or anything. The Dead
Right.
Sea Scrolls don't change anything that the Bible has already taught us. So we get all of our doctrine and theology from the Bible.
Yeah.
But what's amazing is the Dead Sea Scrolls not only contains a lot of history, but a lot of prophecy that helps add context to some of the things in the Bible. So one really good example, and I'm sure we'll get into this conversation more later, but they had their own calendar system, and the people who kept the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was a community of Zadokian priests in Qumran that lived in Qumran. They wrote and kept the Dead Sea Scrolls. But then there were also what are called Essenes all throughout Israel, and Essene was like the third faction of Jewish belief system at the time. So you had Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. It's sort of how we have Protestants and Catholics and I don't
Right.
know, Orthodox, Greek Orthodox.
Yeah.
It's sort of like that. They're different schools of thought, different interpretations. But the Essenes maintained that they said that they maintained the original Jewish interpretation of the Old Testament that the Old Testament teaches. And when you read through the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were right. It's really interesting when you read through the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's a lot of Christianity in there before Christ.
Yeah.
So it's really phenomenal. And then obviously the Pharisees and Sadducees had wildly different beliefs about a lot of things. Like the Pharisees believed that prophecy had ceased, that there wasn't any such thing as like new prophecies anymore. The Essenes clearly didn't believe that, and the Sadducees basically kind of didn't really believe in anything. They didn't even
Mhm.
believe like in an afterlife or angels or any of that stuff. So, three very different schools of thought. So the Essenes would have been the ones that would have studied the Dead Sea Scrolls and what was called the Testament of the Patriarchs, which we have found fragments of that as well. And that's the like last will and testament of the early patriarchs. Apparently, I believe it was from Adam to Abraham, and we have little pieces of some of that stuff. Adams we have nothing about except in Josephus's writings. He made mention that in Adam's testament there was a prophecy that the world would be destroyed once by water and once by fire.
Right.
And so we get things like that in historical texts. So they would have followed that interpretation that was laid out by the Testament of the patriarchs, and again, it falls right in line with what we believe as Christians as well. They were waiting for the Messiah, and they so the Pharisees had this interpretation that there was going to be two Messiahs. One would come and basically help them win a war and then die, and then another would come later and do something else. Well, the Essenes believed in one savior in two comings. Like he was going to come and fulfill, this certain set of prophecies. Then something would happen. He would die, and then he would come back. And they didn't know all the ins and outs of it, but they knew a lot more than the Pharisees and Sadducees did. So, and this is why when you read through the Gospels, there are times Jesus will be talking to somebody or a group of people, and all of them get saved immediately with he almost doesn't even have to say anything, and they just get saved. And then other times he'll be talking to a group of people, and it doesn't matter if he's doing miracles, it doesn't matter what he's doing, these people just will not accept him. Well, this is the difference between the Essenes and like say the Pharisees or Sadducees, because the Essenes were already looking for the stuff that Jesus was doing. They even knew when he was going to be born. They knew when his ministry was going to start. They knew when he was going to die. They knew a lot, and all of these are found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, all of these prophecies, proven to be at least 200 years before the birth of Christ. So this isn't like fraud, or this isn't like a forgery or something that they just came up with later. They actually predicted this stuff, and they said it was through the power of the Holy Spirit. So that's why in the gospel, some people just accept him because they went there looking for him. They heard the Messiah was there. They've been hearing about this Messiah figure their whole lives, studying these prophecies. And then he shows up. So, of course, they're going to go get saved. Whereas the Pharisees, because they had a wildly different interpretation of what was supposed to happen, what the Messiah was supposed to do, and Jesus wasn't fitting that mold. That's why they just were not accepting it by and large. Some Pharisees did, but by and large, they just rejected Jesus outright. So that's what's important for us as Christians, is to see like how our history really evolved from Judaism to Christianity, because we're grafted into that natural branch as Gentiles. And so us as Christians just getting to see that progression is really interesting. But then also the prophecies that they had about their own time, which validate the Dead Sea Scrolls and their authenticity, but also some of the prophecies they've had about our time. One thing I was going to mention, they had their own calendar system. So there's a lot of times throughout the Bible, the Bible uses the Essene calendar system from Genesis to Revelation all the way through. So there's a lot of times in the Bible that it'll say, on the third day of this month, or, they'll give like a specific day. Well, when that happens, if you go to the Dead Sea Scroll calendar, not the Pharisee calendar or the modern Jewish calendar or any other calendar, the ancient Dead Sea Scroll calendar, you can actually pinpoint like if there was a festival on that day or why that date is being described, because nothing in the Bible is by accident. And even in there's a lot of prophetic things. Like you can, one debate is, the two witnesses. Do they come in the first half of the tribulation or the second half? Well, the Essene calendar system actually answers that. They have to come in the first half. It's the only way that it fits. And that's why the Bible gives us all of these prophetic day counts, 1,200 some odd days for this, and 1,335 days for this. You can map all that out on the Essene calendar, and it fits perfectly. So the Bible uses this calendar that the Essenes say God gave to Adam, and they maintained it the whole time. It's actually really interesting history too, because the reason for the split in the first place seems to be it probably was Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth. Could have been the fifth, but it was probably the fourth, when he came and desecrated the temple and did all that. It seems like what happened somewhere around that time, the Jewish leadership were given an ultimatum. Like, we'll still let you do some of your Jewish things, but you have to adopt the Seleucid calendar. And actually, when you go back and when you look at what the Seleucid calendar would have been at that time, it matches up really closely to like almost identically to what the modern Jewish calendar is now, because they would have gotten that from the Pharisees. Well, so there was a split where some Jews said, okay, we'll do that, it's better than getting slaughtered, and then other Jews said, nope, that's completely unacceptable, we're not doing that at all. And so they were the ones that left. And there was actually a prophecy in the book of Jubilees that talked about that there would come a time where the Jews would abandon the solar calendar, the real calendar, in favor of a pagan lunar calendar. Mm-hmm. And so that's what happened. That's what this split was all about, and that's actually how you get Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. It's more complicated than that. That's just a quick run through of just some of the history of what these people's belief systems were. But the reason they said that the calendar was so important is that you have to do certain rites and rituals. You have to do them on specific festival days, because if you're a day off, or if you don't do the ritual exactly right, you could lose your life over that. And there's even examples in the Bible of that, people who have went into the Holy of Holies when they weren't supposed to, and they would just drop dead. So things had to be done at specific times, because the Essenes believed that on those specific days, angels in heaven were also performing certain heavenly temple duties on the same day. We actually see some of that in the book of Revelation. In Revelation 8, we see the angelic counterpart to the Day of Atonement rituals. Mm-hmm. Now, they're angels. They're not going to be slaughtering animals, obviously. We don't know exactly what all they do. But there's some kind of partnership between the heavenly and the earthly temples during those times. Well, what's really interesting is even by Pharisaical Jewish historical sources, we find out that during the time after that switch, the time before that, all the way back to like the beginning of the temple, there were something like 30 priests or something that had lost their lives, and all those what, a couple thousand years, long time. Well, in the time since they stopped using the calendar up until whenever that was recorded, maybe I don't know, maybe a few decades after the time of Christ. It was like a span of like it was a span of a couple hundred years, few hundred years. But there were 300 priests that lost their lives in that short amount of time. And the reason is because they switched their calendar and they weren't doing things on the right day, so things weren't working the way that they were before. So that's even recorded in Pharisaical Jewish history. So, if anybody was going to lie about it, it'd be them, and they didn't. They actually recorded that did happen. Now, they're not saying the reason why. They didn't say it's because, we abandoned the calendar, we're not doing things on the wrong day, and we, denied the Messiah. They're not saying any of that. They just think that they're just being punished for just overall sin, and so this stuff doesn't work anymore. So it's really interesting history to look back and see how all of this played out, and then how at the time of Jesus, when he gave out the Great Commission, the people that took it the most seriously were converted Essenes, that became Christian. They went out to the four corners of the world. They were the ones that went out and spread the gospel. So we actually, as Christians, we come from the Essenes. So that's why the Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls are so fascinating and so important. Just a few reasons, anyway.
I love that. What a great explanation about that. And I love how you started at the top talking about, it's an extra biblical book, just like the book of, Enoch and things like that. Someone asked me about that the other day because, my husband and I pastor a church. We're the senior pastors and founders of a church here in Miami. And, people get very weird about, oh, the pastor talked about first Enoch, or, they quoted Enoch or what have you. And so, or she's talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, oh, kind of thing. Right. So, I get that, but I think it's important to understand that. And I love what you said, that it's more, I explained this to someone the other day, historical. You've got Josephus's writings, which, are phenomenal historical writings that are factual of what occurred, right? What he witnessed and not. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Tell us how were the Dead Sea Scrolls found? And
so this was really cool. So in the late 40s, there was a Bedouin sheep herder child, and apparently one of the sheep had gotten lost or something. So he was throwing rocks into caves to try to get it back, to like scare it out. And when he was doing this, he heard something break. So he checked it out, found a clay pot with writing in it, and then he went and told somebody apparently. And then excavations were done. And the first thing that they found was Isaiah. And in Isaiah, there's a prophecy about how the old ones will, in the end times, the old ones will speak out of the dust of the earth. Well, that's most likely the Dead Sea Scrolls. Like the old prophets are going to speak. I mean, because we're not expecting there to be like the ghosts of the prophets are going to come up and start speaking again. But speaking out of the dust of the earth, that's where these were found. So it's very likely that in Isaiah that was a direct prophecy. Well, what's interesting about the Isaiah scroll is the guy that was going to bring it back to be studied and stuff. He was actually stuck in Israel for a little while because the war had broken out. When Israel became a nation again. So this happened right at the same time that Israel was becoming a nation again. So this is all prophetic, like a really, really, I mean, it would have to be the craziest coincidence ever if this wasn't prophetic and deliberate, and if God wasn't doing something here.
That's
so
right.
so like I said, the way that I look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're miraculous. I mean, they're prophetic, they're historical, but I would even go far as to say that at least some of them may have been inspired for excuse me.
All You're fine.
I accidentally touched I was adjusting this and it brought up Apple Music.
Oh.
Anyway.
Sing it along.
Yeah. So where was I? What was the last thing I was saying?
Oh my goodness, I'm thinking about the songs now that you're hearing in your ear. You were talking about totally... how miraculous it was to have found the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Oh, right. So we as Christians, there is importance there for us. There's good things we can glean from it. But I would not say that like every Christian needs to read the Dead Sea Scrolls. Like if there's anybody watching, if you've got any apprehension about it, don't read them. That's totally fine.
Yeah.
It took me a while too. I was brought up in a really like I don't like more fundamentalist Baptist upbringing, and nothing against that at all. But it took me a while to kind of get used to the idea of even how to look at the Book of Enoch, except as just something that you're never ever supposed to read. Don't even think about it. Don't touch it. It's sinful. And I was kind of brought up in that without really giving a reason why. It's like, well, it's not in the Bible, so don't read it. It's like, well, yeah, the manual for my toaster oven's not in the Bible either. But if my toaster oven breaks, I want to read that and see what it says. It still contains truth.
Yeah.
So it took me a while too. And so if somebody's listening to this for the first time and they're like, I don't know about that, it's not going to make you more Christian. You're not going to be like super saved by reading the Dead Sea Scrolls. It'll just be an interesting thing. And if you're interested in history and prophecy, you're going to get a lot of that out of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And if not, then the best advice is just stick with the Bible. And but yeah, so I try to make that separation for people, just so nobody thinks I'm not saying that you're gonna get more out of, like, in a spiritual way. You're not going to get more out of your Bible if you read the Dead Sea Scrolls. You will in a context way. And sure, God can use that in people's lives to bring them closer to him. For other people, he may not. He may use other things. So yeah, even if I allow for the possibility that some of these scrolls were inspired for a time, and I think many of them were. I mean, they contain accurate prophecy. So that we know that 100% accurate prophecy can only come from God.
Exactly.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's inspired for us now. But that also doesn't mean that it's not useful for us now. So, in the first part of the book, I really try to explain all that on just how to look at this. And the best thing, like you said, the best thing is like just see, you look at it as history. It's historically true. You're not going to get new spiritual revelations from the Dead Sea Scrolls. At least you shouldn't, because everything is in the Bible. If you're getting some new spiritual, like, something from it, then you're probably misreading it.
Yeah.
Because all of the extra biblical stuff that I've gone through, all of it falls right in line with the Old Testament, and you can see how the New Testament was brought forth from that line of thinking as well. But
Right.
even the Essenes didn't have it perfect. Jesus still had to correct them on some things. The Essenes were really into oaths, like promises. They were really into that, to the point that if somebody broke an oath, they basically hated that person, like in an unhealthy way.
Wow.
So this is why you get well, when Jesus was in what was it, Samaria with the two apostles, and they're like, well, hey, should we just rain fire down and just kill them all now? He's like,
Right.
no. And those were Essene apostles that were with him. So they had to be corrected on some stuff too. They weren't perfect.
Right.
But they had to be corrected a lot less than the Pharisees or the Sadducees. I mean, it would be like if Jesus was around, today in bodily form. Like if Jesus decided to come, now instead of 2,000 years ago. Well, we would be asking a lot of the same questions. Which interpretation is right? Is it a preacher rapture? Is it Protestant? Is it Catholic? We have our own set of things that we would be asking and wondering about, and that we would need to be corrected on too. Like I'm totally a Protestant, through and through. But I am sure there's still plenty of stuff. Like if I'm right on that, I'm sure there's still plenty of stuff I would need to be corrected on. So the Essenes didn't have it all 100% perfect either. They were the closest to it. And one of the things that we can really glean from the Essenes is that they were teachable. Jesus was able to teach them and correct them, and they adopted Jesus' ways when they conflicted with some of the stuff that they learned. And a lot of that had to do with love and forgiveness and stuff like that, because they were, they were pretty hard nosed about how they would treat somebody if they broke an oath, or the way that they thought about the Pharisees. Some of their writings, I mean, hate might be too strong of a word, but they were definitely looking forward to a day when God would punish these people, and it's all over in their writing, because of their great sins and everything. So yeah, there's when I read through the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's like, man, this is so interesting. There's a lot of prophecy here, but you can tell little places where it's not that they're teaching doctrine that's incorrect. It's just they haven't yet been corrected by Jesus in some of these areas. So it's interesting to see that. It's kind of like when you get Christian authors today, sometimes
Right.
like 90% of the book is great, but there's this 10%, I don't know if it aligns well. It's sort of the same thing. So I think that's interesting to see.
So was John the Baptist an Essene?
I believe so. Yeah, I think there's some strong evidence for that. In fact, they had a so one of the first things is baptism. So a lot of Christians kind of have this just vague idea that John the Baptist like made up baptisms, like he invented the concept of it. That's not true. Jewish people have been doing it forever, ritualistic cleansings. But what's interesting is the way that John the Baptist did it was different than the way that the Pharisees did it. And John the Baptist did it in accordance to what's called the rule of the community, which is a Dead Sea Scroll, and it basically lays out, like, if you're going to be Essene, or if you're going to be a Zadok priest, like, here's what you do, here's what we believe, here's what you don't do. It's basically just the rules of being in that community. Well, they had they have one that says he should not go into the waters to share in the pure food of men of holiness, for they have not been cleansed unless they turn away from their wickedness, for it is unclean among all the transgressors of his word. Now, what's immediately striking about that passage from the rule of the community is that it does sound almost exactly like our understanding of baptism today as modern Christians. So first, we have to accept Jesus as Savior and repent of our sins, which is just another way to say turn from wickedness, and then we can get baptized. Well, that's what John was doing. So his ministry efforts, including baptism, was actually located only half a day's walk from Qumran. And we get that from John 1:28, which mentions Bethabara as the place of John's baptisms. So there was also the prophecy in Isaiah 40 verse 3, the voice of him that crieth in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Mm-hmm. Well, when we look at the interpretations of the Qumran community, we find something really amazing. So the Dead Sea Scrolls record the belief of the Qumran community that they were to fulfill that prophecy in the book of Isaiah about being a voice in the wilderness that paves the way for the coming of Messiah. So from the community rule, it says, and when these exist as a community in Israel in compliance with these arrangements, they are to be segregated from within the dwelling of the man of sin, to walk to the desert to open there his path, capital H, talking about God. As it is written, in the desert, prepare the way of Yahweh, straighten in the step a roadway for our God. Now, as we know from the Gospel of John, this prophecy was fulfilled by John the Baptist. It was explained in his own words. So John 1:23 says, John said, I am the voice of one shouting in the wilderness, make straight the way for the Lord, as the prophet Isaiah said. So if the Qumran community believed that they were supposed to fulfill this prophecy, and if John the Baptist claimed that he was the fulfillment of it, then it makes perfect sense that John the Baptist would have at least been a member of the Qumran community. But not only that, John the Baptist was probably more than a member of the community. He may have been the leader of the school of the prophets, which would have still been in effect. There's an ancient document, and I include it in my book, but there's an ancient document that lists all of the leaders of the school of the prophets ever since it started, up to basically up to John. And it lists John the Baptist as one of the final members before everything happened and they had to leave. Now, what's interesting too is there's a description of how the master of the community is to behave and what responsibilities he has. So this is from the community rule, column 9. It says, he shall impart true knowledge and righteous judgments to those who have chosen the way. This is the time for the preparation of the way into the wilderness. So what's interesting there too, that not only does that sound like John the Baptist, but in Acts, we hear Paul talk about a sect called the Way. Well, that's how the Essenes, that's how the Qumran community referred to themselves. They called themselves the Way. And so it says right here, so if John the Baptist was the leader of the Qumran community, then, that would give additional weight to his description of himself as being, the voice of one shouting in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord. And this also seems to point back to, the purpose of the master of the Qumran community, according to the community rule. Also, another weird detail is John the Baptist's diet of locusts. So in Mark 1:6, it says, John was clothed with camel's hair and with a girdle of a skin about his loins, and he did eat locusts and wild honey. And now what's interesting is there's another document called the Damascus document, and this was like another, it might have been part of the community rule, but this was another document that talked more about the Qumran community, what they were supposed to do, the rules and regulations. But what's strange is the Damascus document provides details on how locusts were actually to be eaten. So from the Damascus document 12:14b to 15a, it says, and all the locusts, according to their kind, shall be put into fire or into water while they're still alive, as this is the regulation of their species. So as it stands right now, there are some differences of opinion about whether locusts were a common delicacy in Israel during this time. However, the evidence seems to indicate that it was extremely rare and may have only been known within the Qumran community. So I'll just give a quick quote on this. Footnote 7 of chapter 3 of his book, Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls, John Bergsma, PhD, states, quote, James Charlesworth argues that John the Baptist ate like a former Essene. Against him, James A. Kellhofer claims that locust eating was common in first century Palestine. However, all of Kellhofer's evidence comes from time or locations that are remote from first century Palestine. For example, Assyrian reliefs from the 700s BC depict roasting locusts and even older materials. This would be like citing Chaucer to show that eating blackbirds was common in 20th century England. For the time period of Qumran, Kellhofer can cite only the letter of Aristeas and Philo, but these are apologetic works defending the rationality of the Mosaic Law to a classical audience, not direct attestations of Jewish culinary practice. The cleanliness of locusts is discussed in the Mishnah and other rabbinic traditions. However, not only do these post-date the first century, but it is frequently the case that the rabbis would debate the application of the law to merely theoretical or highly unlikely scenarios. So it's difficult to make direct connection between the Mishnah and actual first century practice. So while that might kind of seem like a trivial point, if eating locusts was rare in Israel, and all the evidence seems to indicate that it was extremely rare, yet the Qumran community described exactly how it should be done in their texts, then it would stand to reason why the Bible is telling us that John had this diet of locusts. It's one way of saying, like, he belongs to this group of Essenes because they're the only ones that are doing that. There's also another piece of evidence is the lineage and priesthood of John the Baptist. So John the Baptist would have been eligible for the priesthood according to the Torah. And we know this because the Gospel of Luke describes John's father, Zechariah, as a priest of the course of Abiah. And John's mother, Elizabeth, is one of the daughters of Aaron, which would make John the Baptist a descendant of Aaron from both his mother and father's side. And we get that from Luke 1:5. So John would have been expected to minister in the temple like his father. Now remember that that's under Pharisee control at this time. So his father would have been a Pharisee. So then John would have been expected to follow in ministering to the temple like his father when he was old enough to do so. But we find something different happened. So according to the Gospel of Luke, Luke 1:80, it says, "And the child grew and waxed strong in spirit and was in the deserts till the day of his showing unto Israel." So something happened that caused John to not be with his parents and to minister in the temple, but instead to live in the wilderness. And this apparently was the case from the time he was a child until his public appearance during the time of Christ. So what could have happened? Well, as we know from Josephus, we know that the Qumran community was known for taking in children who were not always theirs by birth and raising up in the ways of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So in Jewish Wars, book 2, chapter 8, verse 2, Josephus says, "But choose out other persons' children while they are pliable and fit for learning, and esteem them to be of their kindred, and form them according to their own manners." So it was kind of like apprenticeship for children, for parents who wanted their children to go and learn the Essene way, then they were allowed to do that. Well, it's possible that as a child, John was sent to be brought up by the Qumran community. I mean, because we remember what happened to Zechariah. He saw the angel, he couldn't talk for a while. You know, after all of that happening, he would probably assume, okay, my Pharisee ideas, I don't think they're right. I think because he would have been familiar with the Essenes. Everybody was familiar with each other. So, you know, since this angel and this whole thing happened, this is the Messiah, this is the Essene interpretation. John can't be brought up in the Pharisee way. He's got to go live with the Essenes. So that could help explain why John was out in the wilderness and not ministering in the temple following his father's footsteps. So all of that evidence put together, and just the way that John talks, the way that his teachings, it very much feels like it comes right out of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So yeah, I think chances are very, very high that John the Baptist was an Essene. John the Apostle too was most likely an Essene as well.
Well, it's so interesting because you think then back at everything that happened, like you said, with John the Baptist, when even before he was born, and you know what happened with Zechariah, his father, you know, when Mary came to visit Elizabeth and the child, you know, leaped in her womb. And so they must have known that this child was special. This child was going to prepare the way for the Lord, you know? And so that's kind of neat to know that, right? And then as you were talking, I was thinking about, remember when John was imprisoned, and he asks that he sends, you know, one of his disciples, go ask, you know, Jesus, are you it? Are you the Messiah, right? And Jesus,
or do we wait for another?
Or do we wait for another?
Yeah, so, see, because what he was really asking is, are you the Messiah? Do I have this right? He wasn't doubting. It would just be like if Jesus came down today, I would be like, hey, are the Catholics right or am I right? So I think I'm right, but am I? You know, because I want to do whatever you want, Jesus. He was just confirming. And what's interesting is Jesus's his reply He said, tell John the Baptist you saw me do these things. And he gives out a list of, I think, 6 different things.
Uh-huh.
Well, all of them except one are found in the Old Testament. So he said, tell John the Baptist to tell him that, all these things, and I raised the dead. There's no Old Testament prophecy anywhere that talks about the Messiah raising the dead as one of the signs that you know that it's the Messiah. But there is a Dead Sea Scroll about that talks about what the Messiah is going to do when he comes. So for Jesus to give an answer like that, that's like endorsing the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's saying no. It's basically like, tell John the Baptist he's got it right. It's me. You're not going to wait for another one. I'm fulfilling these prophecies now. I'm doing all these things and raising the dead, which again is not in the Old Testament. So, but it's in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which the Pharisees wouldn't have been reading. The Sadducees definitely wouldn't have been reading. Only the Essenes would have been studying that. And again, the Pharisees had a much different idea of what the Messiah was supposed to be doing, what he was supposed to be fulfilling than the Essenes did. So that's why Jesus answered him like that. And you would only give that answer to another Essene. So that's the only way that it makes sense. So yeah, again, that's another really good piece of evidence showing that John the Baptist was most likely an Essene.
That's so cool. I love that.
Yeah.
And our modern minds really don't understand that. Um, you've got like you said, your Pharisees, your Sadducees, the Essenes. So it's all these different sects, for a lack of a better word, you're right, and groups, just like
Yeah.
the denominations and things like that. And a lot of
Yep.
times when we read the Bible, we think, oh, this is the Jewish mindset. This was the Jewish mindset. Well, no, not necessarily. They had different schools of thought. So it really
Yeah.
packages it in a way where then you can understand why Jesus said some of the things he said, including what he answered for John the Baptist. Man, I love that.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good point too, because we're always told like, no Jew ever knew, like no Jew knew what the Messiah was going to be. Everyone got it wrong. None of them got it right. And that's not exactly true. The Pharisees and Sadducees got it wrong. The Essenes knew who the Messiah was going to be. And that's why, again, it was so easy for Jesus to convince certain people, but not other people. It was
Right.
where they were in their belief system at the time. Were they following the Essene way or the Pharisee way or the Sadducee way? And the Essenes, they by and large just accepted Jesus for exactly what he was, because they had such specific prophecies about what to expect that go even beyond what our Old Testament tells us, and adds a lot of context to some of those Old Testament prophecies, because they even kept prophetic like commentaries. So like from the book of Habakkuk, they would have the book, but then they would have their own like commentaries in there, and a lot of them were interpretations of prophecies. So they would say the interpretation of this prophecy is X, Y, and Z, and they would lay that out, and a lot of times they would tie that back to the Messiah that was to come. So it's really interesting to see that. We don't always know how they came up with their interpretations, apparently by the Holy Spirit. But those interpretations, they fit with the Messiah. They fit with the end of their age of Torah, which is fascinating to see.
Yeah, for sure. Now, you've been talking about the Qumran scrolls. We started off with the Dead Sea Scrolls. So you got Dead Sea Scrolls, Qumran scrolls. Tell
They're the
what
same thing.
so it's the same thing, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
just a different name for it, right?
yep,
Okay,
yep,
just so
yep. It's all one big collection of scrolls, and yes, Qumran scrolls, Dead Sea Scrolls. It's all the same thing.
yeah, fascinating to see. We've been to Israel several times, and then we've gone to the
Oh, cool.
museum there, and so it's just a fascinating thing to see. So in your volume 2 of your book, you wrote about the final jubilee of the church age, and you very briefly touched on that. Can you talk a little bit about
Yeah,
that? Elaborate on that?
yeah, sure. So this goes back to the Essene calendar system,
Okay.
and it's so phenomenal because again, and I show in several examples throughout the book, I show how the Bible does follow this calendar system from Genesis to Revelation. You can take any historical event, as long as there's a date provided in the Bible, or some kind of indication of what month or day. And you can do that with prophecy too, because we get a bunch of different day counts, and you can use this calendar to kind of map out roughly when things are going to happen. Now, I'll preface all of what I'm about to say. I'm going to preface by saying we don't know the day or the hour.
Yeah.
We might be able to know the season, we might be able to at least gauge the season.
Yeah.
But also with the Qumran calendar, we believe that it's extremely accurate as we understand it right now because it fits with the Bible so well. But I still allow in the book, I still allow the possibility that we could be a year or two off. We can't say for sure. But also, there's no prophecy in the Dead Sea Scroll about when the rapture will happen or when exactly Jesus will return. It doesn't say it, but we can piece together some things. So the way that they looked at all of human history, you actually could call them dispensationalists, but it's a little bit different than modern dispensationalism today. They believed in just like how we have decades and centuries and millennia. Well, they had 7 years, which was a Shemitah. They had a set of 70 years or 50 years, excuse me, which was a Jubilee. Then they had Onas, which were 500 years, and then Ages, which are 2,000 years. And so they believed that there would be basically 4 ages, technically 3.5, but there would be 3 full ages that are 2,000 years apiece, and then a final 1,000-year Sabbath. Now, immediately, we as Christians would recognize that as the millennial reign of Christ. And that's how the Dead Sea Scrolls describe it as well. They don't say Jesus Christ because they didn't have his name, but they talk about the Messiah. They usually call him Melchizedek or something like that. Or the teacher of righteousness. That's another popular word for the Messiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But anyway, so they had predictions for each of these time periods. And they said at the end of each age, there's an apostasy. So the end of the first age would have been from creation to the call of Abraham. Well, right before, around that same time, the call of Abraham, you have the whole Tower of Babel incident, like right before that. So that was the apostasy. Then there was the age of Torah, which went from the call of Abraham to 75 AD. So it didn't end exactly with the destruction of the temple. The destruction of the temple happened in 70 AD. It happened 5 years later when the final nail in the coffin of the old Pharisaical way was done away with. When they made the decision, we don't have to do temple practices anymore. We just have to pray and be righteous because we don't have a temple. So what can we do? And so the Essenes would have said the age of grace, and they actually called it that. Our time today, they called it the age of grace. Started in 75 AD. Now, there is some overlap here because we would say, well, the church age started at Pentecost. And yes, it's technically true. But both of these things are true. On the calendar side, just the calendar side, by the time 75 AD rolled around, everything was in place. Everything had been done. The prophecies had been fulfilled for the church age to officially begin. Pieces of the church age definitely started earlier. It's like if I'm going to have a birthday party at Friday at 3:00. Well, Monday I might look up attractions and hire a clown or something if it's a kid's birthday party. Wednesday I might go buy all the presents, and Thursday I might order the cake, and then Friday 2:00 I might go pick up the cake before people start arriving. So these things can happen, but the idea is at 3:00 on Friday, everything should be fulfilled. Everything should be put in place for the party to actually begin. So I think it's kind of the same thing. Pentecost was a piece of the church age. But still, the temple hadn't been destroyed. The old Pharisaical system hadn't been completely done away with yet. There were other things before the official date. So there is some overlap. Well, there was obviously an apostasy at that time too. So by our best efforts in trying to date when this officially happened, it would have been 32 AD. And there's actually an Essene prophecy in the Dead Sea Scrolls that mark that exact date as the date that the Messiah would be cut off for the transgression of sins. They had it down to the exact date, 32 AD. So we have this final Jubilee-ish to deal with, because between Jesus, so between 25 and 75 AD, that would have been the final Jubilee of the age of Torah, and ages in 2,000 years. Well, what's coming up next year? 2025 will start technically, because the calendars are a little different from our own. Technically, it would be March of 2026 would be the start of it. But our final Jubilee in our age, if the Essenes are correct, and there's no reason to think that they're not because they've been right so far, our final Jubilee starts March. It's early to mid-March. I forget the exact date. But March of 2026 will be the very beginning of our final Jubilee, our final 50 years, according to the Essene calendar. Now, when I say that, people usually freak out because they say, I'm not going to make it till 2075, Josh. I'm already 50, 60 years old. I'm not saying that. Jesus came really early in the final Jubilee of the Torah age. That final Jubilee started in 25 AD. By 32 AD, he was already crucified. Pentecost had already happened. A lot of these prophecies were already fulfilled in that short amount of time. We could easily have the same thing happen again. There's a lot of different ways this could play out, and the Dead Sea Scrolls don't tell us specifically how it will, but you can have a rapture at any time if you're a pre-trib person like I am, and if not, that's totally fine. But if you are, then you could have a rapture at any time, and there could be a long gap between the rapture and the beginning of the tribulation. We know that we have 7 years somewhere where there's going to be major apostasy at the end of this age. And it's interesting how that time period is winding down. Like in the first age, the Tower of Babel incident, all of that, when you do all the math and everything, it's about 120 years that all of that took. But then the age of Torah, it's like the last 40 or 50 years about. And then at the end of our age, it's down to 7 years. So it's interesting how the time period is like shortening like that. But you could have a rapture today, and you could have the start of the tribulation, which the start of the tribulation begins with the confirmation of the covenant with many. It doesn't begin with the rapture. And that's a big misconception among a lot of Christians. They think the rapture starts the tribulation. No, it could be very close, or there could be a long gap. So you could have the rapture happen, and you could have decades until the tribulation begins. Or you could have the tribulation could be really early in our final Jubilee. Tribulation could start at any time. And then when Jesus returns, well, we know from the end of the book of Ezekiel, there's going to be a temple that's built. We know there's going to be a great city that's built. There's actually going to be a fourth temple in the millennium that's going to be used. And it lays all of that out at the last few chapters of Ezekiel. Well, how long is it going to take to build that? Because I really don't think Jesus is going to come down, snap his fingers, and it's all just going to be different. I think we're actually going to have to, not me and you, but survivors from the tribulation that make it to the millennium, the human beings, they're going to have to build this stuff. And what's really interesting is Herod took about 40 years building that temple. Well, if it takes roughly 40 years to build a temple, or to cleanse it and build it up more or whatever, and the city, well, that timeline fits in really well if you have an early tribulation. If the tribulation happened early in our final Jubilee, then it takes 30, 40 years, whatever, until 2075 for the temple and everything to be built, so that by 2075 everything is set in place that the millennium can officially begin. So it's kind of the same thing that we had in the Torah age. There's a lot of prophecies that needed to be fulfilled, and it seems like the stuff that had to do with like the spirituality, like Pentecost, that happened early, but then the temple stuff happened a little later. So it could be the same thing. It could be that Jesus returns, and all the judgment happens. Which, how long does the judgments take? I mean, he's got to judge everybody. That's probably going to take a while. There's a lot of things that we're not told exactly how long it takes for that all to happen. We just know that there is a 1,000-year millennium reign at some point. So there's many different ways. So I don't want people to, because I get this comment all the time, right when they hear 2075, it's unavoidable at this point, but I get the comment, oh, I can't wait till 2075. Or they'll say like, I cannot believe that it would take that long for Jesus to return. I'm not saying that. It could take longer. I don't know. Who knows? It could be that we've misinterpreted all of this, and it's going to be another 1,000 years before he returns. I don't know for sure. But if we're understanding the prophecies correctly, if we're understanding the calendar correctly, then according to the Essenes, by the time of 2075, everything should be put in place. But there's a lot of big things that need to happen that would take decades, like building the city and the temple, teaching the whole world how the new how things are going to happen now. I mean, there's a whole new set of rules in the millennium, and we can read about those in Ezekiel, but it's totally different. Delegates from other countries have a responsibility to come to tabernacles. Well, how long is it going to take to teach all the leaders of these countries that, and to tell them what even tabernacles is if they don't know? And plus all of the rituals, there's sacrifices even in the millennium. There's a lot of things that need to be set up before the millennium can officially start, but that doesn't mean that the millennium starts right when, like, the day Jesus returns. There could be decades in between when Jesus returns and when the millennium reign officially begins, because a lot has to be set up. So I really don't want people to freak out about that 2075 date. That's just what the Essenes are saying, that we're about to enter into our final Jubilee. But just remember, in the age of Torah, Jesus did a lot of things really early in their final Jubilee. So it stands to reason he might do the same thing in ours. He might do things a little early in our final Jubilee. So we'll have to see what the next few years hold. But at the very least, that final Jubilee transitioning point in all of the other ages seems to be a time of, yes, apostasy and persecution, but also a time of great miracles. So we should start seeing a lot more prophecy be fulfilled, perhaps some more miraculous things, probably some more problems too because of the apostasy, but we're already seeing that every day, and it's getting worse every day, and we all recognize that. So yeah, we're gonna have to just see how the next few years pan out and see what happens.
Very interesting. You said something a minute ago about the rapture. I'm a pre-tribulation rapture believer as well, so high five for that. And I know that it's contentious. I know that I just talked to our church about it just yesterday, actually. But yeah, it's a lot of people get very nasty about where you stand with the tribulation. I mean, with the rapture, and whether there is a rapture or not. But anyway, I'll leave that to the side. But you said something about that, a lot of people believe that the tribulation begins right after the rapture. So you're saying no, right?
Well, I'm saying it's a possibility that it might not. The technical start of the tribulation is the Antichrist confirming the covenant with many, which is Israel. So once Israel enters into this covenant with the Antichrist, that sets the time. That's the beginning of the tribulation. Now, that could be one day after the rapture, or it could be 30 years after the rapture. We don't really know. And everybody has different opinions about it. So all I'm saying is it's possible that there could be a long gap between the rapture and the beginning of the tribulation. Maybe it might not pan out that way. There could be a long gap between when Jesus returns and when the millennium officially starts as well. So it seems like somewhere in there would be some gap somewhere, and we don't know exactly where or how. But yeah, so the rapture does not start the tribulation, but it could happen that day or a day before or 10 years before. We just don't know.
Yeah. In my mindset, I always remember how, well, the marriage supper of the Lamb, right? The marriage supper of the Lamb. We have to understand then that that's going to happen at some point in time. It was my understanding that happens when we're raptured. And
well, that brings up a sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you're good.
No, it brings up a really good point, because according to the Essenes, time runs the same in heaven as it does earth. Right. When we get raptured, we get rewards. Well, how long does that take? How long does it take for Jesus to have a session with everybody, presumably individually? It seems to be the case when Paul is describing it. It seems to be, an individual by individual basis. Well, how long is that going to take? I could see that taking decades. There's a lot of Christians, and not everybody's going to get rewards. We know that, but many of them are. So how long does it take? And I even tried doing some calculations in the book to try to get some kind of estimate, and it's impossible, because we don't really know how many Christians are on the planet. There's a lot of people that claim to be Christian that really aren't. But if time runs the same in heaven as it does earth, well, that's going to take time. Like, it's going to take time for him to go through everybody to present them with rewards. And we don't know how long that process is. Like, do we have to sit down with Jesus and go over every single moment of our lives? Or is it more of an instantaneous thing where we just kind of know when we see him and we get the rewards that we've earned? Yeah. We're not really told. But even with that, if there's a gap between the rapture and the start of the tribulation, because We know also when Jesus breaks the first seal, that's the Antichrist. So that seems to signify the beginning of the tribulation in Revelation. Well, Jesus was somewhere. He was somewhere before he came and took the scroll. And John cried because there was nobody. There was nobody on the earth, under the earth, above the earth, there, in heaven. There was nobody anywhere that was worthy to take the scroll. Where was he? Where was Jesus? He couldn't have been on the earth, couldn't have been under the earth, couldn't have been above the earth. Like there's only one place, and it's because of that marriage supper of the Lamb thing. There was one place, and that's the bride and groom chamber after they get married. You know, with humans, that's for, you know, but but I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of a neat allegory because for us that would be a private time with us and our Lord where we go through our lives. We see, I assume, like we'll see how Jesus was working in our lives when we didn't even know it, and we received some kind of gift or reward from that. Well, in Jewish culture, no one was allowed to go into those chambers when the bride and the groom were in there. No one was allowed. It was basically like they weren't even there. Like it's just they would even have people stand guard in front of the door to make sure. So they were not seen during that time, the bride and the groom. Well, then it makes perfect sense then why John couldn't see Jesus, didn't know where he was. He wasn't in heaven, he wasn't on earth, he wasn't under the earth. Where else could it be? That would be the most private place that Jesus could be, where John wouldn't have known about it. And right after that, he comes, takes the scrolls. The 24 elders have their gifts, and those are the exact gifts. The crowns, the white robes, like all of the gifts are the same exact gifts that John described in the first 3 chapters of Revelation, that he was promising these Christian churches, if they persevere, if they keep the faith, that they're going to receive these gifts. Well, that's what the 24 elders are. They're Christians. They're raptured believers that have already been given their gifts. That's the only thing they can be when you actually read through the description. And I write a lot about that in the book as well, which to me is like probably the biggest evidence of the pre-trib rapture, is that because you have to make the 24 elders something else in order to have a different rapture belief. And with the things that they say, the song that they sing, you redeemed us by your blood, that could only be referring to Christians. So anyway, I threw a lot out at you there, but all of that put together, so that it would make sense to me if there was a rapture and a long gap between the beginning of the tribulation, because Jesus still has things to do. He's gonna give us some rewards, and then we're gonna learn our place. You know, we're gonna learn what our responsibilities are. And so we have that time with our Savior, and I believe that's probably why John didn't know where he was and didn't know what was going on, and nobody could find him. Nobody was found worthy to take the scroll until Jesus is done in the chambers, and then comes out, and then begins the tribulation and all that. That's at least one possibility. There's a lot of different ways that this could be looked at, but I think that seems to fit the text pretty well.
Yeah, well, that's great. I'm glad you mentioned all of that. I think the connection there has always been that the marriage supper of the Lamb would consist of 7 years because of the whole marriage, the 7 days, you know, how it takes 7 days, and then it's alluding to 7 days versus 7 years. So I think that's where kind of the connection is, but you explained it really, really well. I appreciate that. You made a great leeway as we get to close today. I could be here for hours on end with you, but we've got stuff to do, I'm sure, and I want to be considerate of your time. But you mentioned the 24 elders in the book of Revelation, and how you believe they are it connects with the pre-tribulation rapture. I just finished giving a really interesting message at our church, and I mentioned it to you via email the other day, but I talked a little bit about the transfiguration of Jesus from Luke's account, right? And I made the case, again, you know, knowing that a lot of people are not in agreement with the rapture or pre-trib or whatever, but I kind of make the case that, among other things, we see one of the types and shadows, if you will, in the transfiguration of Jesus, and the representation there that you see of Moses and Elijah. You know, the Bible, the Lord allowed the things that are detailed in the Bible for a reason, for a purpose. They're just not flippant, right? That's right. So the representation of both of them, you know, can be a picture of the rapture. And I
Yeah.
believe that there are many Bible verses and accounts that point to a pre-trib rapture. And, I don't need to convince you because you believe in pre-trib rapture as well. But you touched on the 24 elders in the book of Revelation. So real quick, who are they? You said that they represent Christians.
Yep.
How does this prove, in a nutshell, how does this prove the pre-tribulation rapture?
Yeah, because we
Think.
see the 24 elders in Revelation 4 and 5,
Yeah.
and we're given their description. They're described as having the same rewards that Christians are promised if they keep the faith. And the new song that they're singing, well, they're saying things like, "You redeemed us by your blood." So, well, who else did Jesus redeem by his blood? Certainly not angels. That's a very human specific
Yeah.
thing. And for them to be in heaven, they would have had to have been saved. So I believe that these are glorified Christians that have been raptured. These aren't Old Testament and I used to think that too. Maybe it's like the 12 apostles and the 12 patriarchs.
Right.
Well, there's an issue with that though, because we find out through Daniel and comparing that with Revelation that the Old Testament saints aren't resurrected or aren't given their rewards until after the tribulation, right before the millennium. That's when they get their rapture, in a sense. That's when they get glorified. So that can't fit with the Old Testament saints. It could be the 12 apostles. I mean, Jesus said that you'll be seated with me and stuff. So 12 of them could be the apostles, and 12 could be whoever Jesus decides is worthy for that role. But we also know that we're all going to be sitting with Christ. So then people might ask, well, why 24?
Right.
Well, in the original temple, and apparently this would have been the case in the heavenly temple too, because they mirror each other. Well, more accurately, the earthly temple is a shadow of the heavenly temple. But there were 24 courses. There were 24 courses of priests. So it seems like the heavenly temple would have had something like that set up too, possibly with angels. But that might be a temporary place setter until we get there, because we're ultimately promised and destined for those places. So I think that it just mirrors what the earthly temple was, what it was meant to be, what it's going to be in the millennium. And so that's why you have 24 there to represent each of the courses. But there's also thousands, because in the those 24 in ancient Israel, that group of 24 represented thousands of other Jews that had jobs to do. Some were musicians, some wrote songs or praises or prayers. They all had different jobs, and I list them all in the book. Well, that sounds extremely similar to how it's going to be with us. We're going to have different jobs as well too, depending how we lived our lives, depending on just whatever criteria Jesus has for us. But we're also going to rule and reign with him as part of that as well. To some he gives 5 cities, to some 1 city, whatever.
Yeah.
So I believe that we find all that out once we're raptured, we're glorified, and we meet him in the air. I think that's the time that we find out what our responsibilities are and what our rewards are. So by the time we're introduced to the 24 elders, that has already happened, because they have their rewards and they have their places of authority. They have their seats, in a sense. So I believe that's all evidence to show that this would not work with a mid-trib or with a pre-wrath or with a post-trib rapture, because the 24 elders are already there by the time Jesus breaks that first seal. And that, most people believe, that is what unleashes the Antichrist and starts the tribulation. On the earth side, that's when the covenant is made between the Antichrist and Israel. So to me, that just all adds up, and it fits perfectly with the text. And to try to make it something else, like if somebody wants to, they would have to explain the 24 elders in a way that they're like angels, or they're not human somehow, but still have to get around the fact they're saying you redeemed us by your blood. And it doesn't fit with any of the other rapture belief systems. And again, no disrespect to anybody out there who has a different belief system. That's totally fine. I don't think that's anything we should be fighting about for sure,
Yeah.
because we're still all Christian and we're still all going to find out someday
That's
anyway.
right. That's right.
So, but that's what personally leads me to believe more in a preacher rapture than anything else.
Yeah, and they can't be angels because, like you said, they weren't redeemed by the blood of Jesus. Angels
Right.
aren't redeemed by the blood of Jesus.
And
So
they're sitting with Christ. Angels were never
right.
promised that. Angels are always standing up. You don't ever see an angel sitting in a place of authority like that with Christ. We're promised that as human beings. Angels aren't. Maybe there's some place setter thing that happens, but you never see angels actually seated with Christ. They're always standing up, and even in that description, the 4 living creatures are standing up, but the 24 elders are seated down. It's symbolic of a place of authority. Yeah.
Right, right. I love that. Wow, wow, so cool, man. Josh, I could be here forever. We were supposed to get into some quantum physics and things like that in the Bible, but maybe we'll leave that for the next time.
Sure.
I know that time is running away from us. But tell the audience where they can find your work. And I cannot stress enough, you guys, go to Josh Peck's website and grab all his material. But go ahead and share where people can find you, your socials.
Yeah, sure. So if people want to get the books, it's a 2-volume set. So make sure you get both books, because one book will not make sense without the other. You need both. But you can get them at prophecywatchers.com. That's the best place to get it. If you want like the Kindle or the audiobook, yeah, you can go to Amazon. But if you're indifferent, you just want the paperback, why support Jeff Bezos when you could support Prophecy Watchers? So prophecywatchers.com is the best place to get that. And then my personal website is dailyrenegade.com, which, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, I host a variety of videos and TV shows, or streaming like YouTube type shows, but things that I can't put the whole video on YouTube because YouTube has deleted our channels, deleted our content before. So we created Daily Renegade. There's like a watch page that works exactly like YouTube without the censorship. And then there's a community page that works just like Facebook without the censorship. So we as believers, this gives us a place where we can go and we can talk to each other and fellowship, and not have to worry about somebody censoring deleting our posts because we mentioned Israel or something. And it's weird. Like I've had entire videos pulled down just because of mentioning that country's name one time. Hopefully that doesn't happen here. It seems like YouTube is in a place where they're a little bit looser with it now, but it comes and goes. I mean, they're going to be censoring. They censor in different ways now, but so it's dailyrenegade.com, and yeah, it is a membership thing. It's $10 a month or $100 a year, and I suggest people get the $100 a year if they can do it, because it's cheaper in the long run. But we had to do it that way to keep up on the cost of just maintaining the website, but also we're developing apps right now for the phone and for the TV, and then it just helps keep the ministry going. Also, if people want a print version of that calendar that I was talking about, the Essene calendar, Dr. Ken Johnson is the one that really put all this stuff together. He's a really good friend of mine, and we've partnered together to create this print calendar where it's the actual calendar, like our Gregorian calendar, but it has on the top part all the Essene calendar stuff and all of the festivals labeled, so you can literally take this calendar and count out the days. And it's really easy too, because their calendar is every month is 30 days exactly. So if you have something that's like 1,260 days, you can just count by 30s, and it makes it a lot easier.
Okay.
So we have that available. If people want an online free version of it, it's dsscalendar.org, and you can go on that website. That's Dr. Ken Johnson's website, and you can it's dsscalendar.org, and it'll let you look up specific dates, specific years. If something interesting happens in Israel, you can go and find out if it fell on a feast day according to the Essenes. Because again, the Essenes had different feast days than the Pharisees. The Pharisees were all off because they were using a Seleucid calendar, but the Essenes maintained the correct feast day. So you can actually look that up and see if it falls on a feast day or if anything interesting happens. So that's another good resource for people. So yeah, prophecywatchers.com, dailyrenegade.com, and then DSS calendar.org. That's Ken Johnson's website.
Awesome. And people want to support your ministry, they go ahead to
Yep,
dailyrenegade.com as well.
dailyrenegade.com. Before they log in, there's on the homepage, there's a
Mhm.
donate thing. And that would be hugely beneficial to us because we're still in this transition period of moving from Illinois to Oklahoma for the
Yeah,
Prophecy Watchers job. We just sold our house in Illinois. Thank God, praise God that that is
that's
done and over with
awesome.
because it was a nightmare. We had to pay. We ended up paying somewhere around like $10,000 in taxes alone to sell that house. It was
Oh,
just a huge. Yeah, Illinois taxes are horrible.
wow.
It was a huge blow to our bank account, but God's getting us through, and people have been really generous and helping us out. So yeah, and if it's paypal.me/Josh Peck disclosure. That's the easiest one. And then I got a Cash App. It's $Josh Scott Peck. And some people have just sent checks made out to me to the Prophecy Watchers PO box. I don't have a PO box set up just yet.
Okay.
We're working on that. So yeah,
That's
that's all my donation stuff. Thank you for asking about that.
yeah.
A lot of people don't.
Yeah,
I
no,
appreciate it.
absolutely. I totally believe in sowing seeds in fertile ground, and I believe in the work you're doing. I really do, and I
Thank you.
think that you're opening the eyes to and that's what Table Talk is for as well.
Yeah.
So opening the eyes of a lot of people and just opening our minds to biblical facts and digging deeper, right? Because
Amen.
it's not a surface level type of Christianity that we must live. We really should, get in there and get into some deep dives in the Word of God. And man, you get to know the Father's heart a lot more that way, I believe.
Amen. Me
And
too.
so a lot of times we think that the Bible or God is one way or God is like this. No, you've got to understand the heart of the Father. If you don't, then you're missing out a lot. So I do believe in
Amen.
sowing into good and fertile ground, and your ministry is one for sure, Josh. So
Thank
yes,
you. I really
absolutely.
appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right. Well, folks, thanks for listening again. Be sure to go to all of those sites that Josh was just mentioning, and we're going to have you back on. We've got to talk some more about quantum physics. I wanted to talk
Yeah.
about CERN. There's a lot of stuff out there that we can talk about. So thank
Sounds
you
good.
again, Josh. I appreciate your time so much. And you all
Anytime.
be sure to share this with all of your friends and subscribe, like, and share. And we'll see you very, very soon again on another Wednesday night. Take care.